Welcome to A Reason for Hope, your question connection with the entire Word of God. We'd love for you to join the conversation. Simply follow us on our Facebook page at Calvary Christian Fellowship. If you have a question, please text or email us at questionsforhope@gmail.com. And on today's episode, we have a special guest. Let's tune in.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of A Reason for Hope. I am hosting the program today and I'm pretty stoked about it. And my name's Bo, I'm the associate pastor here, and I'm here with someone you know, Peter Martin, and pastor, teacher, author,
it's both of us.
Bike rider.
It's both of us again.
That's right. But it's great to have you on the program with us. Before we kind of launch into the program and give you all the specifics on how you can get in touch with us today, just want to give a big shout out to Pastor Scott. You know, it's his birthday. And, you know, I would sing happy birthday right now, but I know Peter would be really embarrassed for that. And he doesn't want to really chime in. He doesn't got a good voice.
No, I'm pretty tone deaf.
But we are absolutely stoked to be in your life, my friend, and happy birthday. Hope you have a great day and you're eating some fun food with family and friends. So we hope to do a fairly okay job as we're in here.
That's what we're shooting for. What we're fairly shooting okay. Don't get your hopes too high.
That's right. But hopefully you can join us on our Facebook site at Calvary Christian Fellowship. That's on Facebook. So just go to Facebook and search for Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson and you can find us. And you can also email us at questionsforhope@gmail.com. It's right there on the screen, questionsforhope@gmail.com. And so those are the two main ways to get in touch with us, but they can go also to our Reason for Hope YouTube channel and check that out as well. And, you know, I hope everything's going. I hope we're live. I hope it's happening.
I mean, look, I'm seeing it on the...
Okay, we're good. Yeah. We're good, okay, because I have no clue.
Yeah.
So we love to get your questions on the Bible. Right now I'm going through Habakkuk in my morning devos at 9 o'clock. On Calvary Christian Fellowship on the Facebook site. So if you are interested in going through the Bible in more of a devotional style, you can join me every day, Monday through Friday, 9 to around 9:25, and we go through books of the Bible. So we just finished up Philippians, which was absolutely off the charts. Kind of goes along with the book that you wrote called
Fellowship of Suffering. Yeah.
Fellowship of Suffering. So, and why don't you tell people how to get a hold of your book?
Yeah, anyone who wants to get a hold of the book, it's, again, called Fellowship of Suffering. You go on Amazon, and that's the main place where you can buy it. You get the Kindle version as well as the paperback. Otherwise, if you live in the Tucson area or you attend our church, you could actually come to our church, and we have copies here that I can get you. But the content of the book is based around trauma and how it impacts us, and looking at it from a biblical perspective as well as a psychological perspective. Why does trauma affect us the way that it does? And what kind of resources has God given us? And I really focus and hone in on the resources we have in community with Him as well as community with others and how to access those resources. Because unfortunately, when we go through suffering, it tends to isolate us and make us feel like we don't have anyone that understands what we're going through. So it helps you to do that.
Right on. Hey, Kevin. Hey, Mike. I just want to give a shout out and say hello to you, both of you that are in with us right now on A Reason for Hope, and hopefully we can answer some good Bible questions. Tonight, me and Peter, or Peter and I should say, are in the book of Hebrews. We're going to be in chapter 12, starting at verse 3, and getting through
the whole thing.
The whole chapter. Yeah, we're going to really tackle the whole chapter. But, you know, if you know anything about our Wednesday night studies, the reason we laugh is because it seems like we can only get through 1 to 3 verses at a shot as we go through the Bible. And at this rate, you know, it's going to take us a good, 100 years to get through the Bible. So we got to speed things up a little bit. Anyway, it's good to have you guys in the house, everybody on Facebook and YouTube. So if you got a question, let us know. There was some interesting stuff in the news, and it's not, I don't know I mean, biblical significance? I don't know. We could talk about that a little bit, but why don't you share a little bit of that article that you were talking to me about?
Yeah. So this is an interesting precedent, both like from a political perspective, but we're going to bring it into a biblical framework to help people understand. So we're going to come at it from a couple different angles. So just today, I think it's today, this article is dated August 3rd, which I think is the 3rd. Or is it the 4th?
Today is the 4th.
Okay, so it's actually yesterday. So this is from the New York Times. It says, New York City will become the first U.S. city to require proof of at least one dose of the coronavirus vaccine for a variety of activities for workers and customers, indoor dining, gyms, and performances to put pressure on people to get vaccinated. Mayor Bill de Blasio announced Tuesday morning. And this is a direct quote from Bill de Blasio. If you want to participate in our society fully, you've got to get vaccinated, he says at a news conference. It is time. This is going to be a requirement, he added. The only way to patronize these establishments is if you are vaccinated, at least one dose. The same for folks in terms of work. They will need at least one dose, he said, holding up one single finger. So this is kind of a really interesting precedent and something that's new. It's something that hasn't happened in the United States to this date. And this is very disturbing if you think about the implications of it. But essentially what he's getting at is they're singling out various businesses and they're saying you cannot attend, you can't go to these things like gyms, outdoor dining, places like that. And you also cannot work. You can't show up to work if you are not vaccinated with at least one dose of the vaccine. Now, I don't fully know, to be very honest with you, how this is going to affect churches in the New York City area. The way that this is worded, I could see how it would include churches because he mentions performances. So you could say like any gathering of more than like 100 people to see some sort of a performance, you would have to be vaccinated. I could definitely see that, and churches would fall under that category. Now, the first way I wanted to look at it and kind of dialogue with you about it is some Christians have long been talking about the mark of the beast and how the coronavirus vaccine might be the mark of the beast. And listening to this legislation, I could see why people would say that because it kind of sounds like you can't buy, sell, or trade unless you get this particular mark. So what is the mark of the beast? How does that kind of fit into this? And do you think that this is the mark of the beast?
Man, that's a lot of questions you're asking me, bro. No. But I gotta tell you, I had a conversation with someone that I love so much, and their take was kind of like that, was like, hey, is this the mark of the beast? And you're right, there is so many things that I think for us that have been Christians a long time, this might be the first time I've ever, been alive, as a Christian, and thinking like, wow, this is really interesting. Like this can really feel like it.
Right.
It has like a feeling of some kind of, we use the word tyrannical sometimes a little loose nowadays.
Right.
But it kind of feels like that. It feels like there's some kind of, forcing, coercing going on. And when that happens, of course, our Christian, antennas go up. So let's read the passage, and we're going to be in chapter 13 a little bit. And chapter 13 is really important because it talks about two beasts. And one of them is there to prop up the other one. And we get this. This is all the working of Satan. And it says then there's another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and all those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So I think the first thing we need to establish is there are some serious events that have taken place. Right? There is a deadly wound that was healed to the beast, and then there is a worshiping of the first beast. And how would you kind of describe that?
Yeah, so essentially what's going on, if you take it from our perspective, where certain people like preterists, when they go into the book of Revelation, they take it in a more symbolic way.
And a preterist is someone who?
So a preterist is someone who essentially, like, I'm going to butcher this. If there's preterists listening, I'm very sorry. But I'm going to try to give the most simplistic version of your viewpoint. So I'm not trying to be offensive, but in preterism, they essentially believe that the happenings of Revelation, as well as what we call the Olivet Discourse from Jesus discussing the last days, have already taken place. And they reach their climax in AD chapter 70. In AD 70, when the Romans came in, invaded Jerusalem, and exiled the Jews. And we are now living in a symbolic millennial kingdom in which Satan is bound, and we're waiting for the final return of Christ. So a preterist, when they view the book of Revelation, they view it in highly symbolic terms, and most of the things that they believe are being described happened already. So these are historical accounts, not future prophetic accounts. So from our perspective, though, we're not preterists. The way that we would look at this is that there is going to be a literal Antichrist, a literal person who is going to be a political figure, who is going to rule an area that's going to include Israel, that's going to be affecting Israel and the Middle East. And he is going to rule this in a very paganistic way, and then at a certain point he's going to shift and he's going to rule it in a very tyrannical, but also almost like a pharaoh kind of way, where he's going to declare himself a deity in some sense. And what's being described in Revelation in this section is his ministry, if you want to call it that, is moving from purely political to becoming theological. Now there's a theological aspect to his empire and his rule, and it's going to be a heavy-handed one. So it's not just like in America, where we can kind of say, well, we're a Christian nation. Most of the people here are evangelical Christians, things like that, which is a changing figure, by the way. But it's going to be more like a Sharia law kind of an environment, where it's either you have to follow the dictates of our religious system or you can't participate in it, which leads into this mark of the beast. How do you show that you are a part of this theological system?
Yeah, so there's a timeline that we're given in the book of Revelation, a certain period of time. We look at it as a literal 3.5 year, these 3.5 year divisions within the book of Revelation. And that this 7-year period is still yet to come. And within this 7-year period, this is when this is going to happen, where this beast will come on the earth. And he has these horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. We know the dragon reference in the book of Revelation is actually a reference to chapter 12. So it's a reference to Satan. And then it talks about this, he will cause everybody on the earth, those who dwell in it, to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. And so it says he performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. So when this worship takes place, there's some serious miraculous things happening.
Right.
And it says, and he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. And so this false prophet tells those who dwell on the earth to make this image of the beast. And then there was a power, this is so radical, that was given
a supernatural power,
breath that was given to the image of the beast. And when you see that kind of idea of breath biblically, it really takes us all the way back to Revelation, or back to Genesis, right? The idea of the beginning of mankind, God breathes, into them, and so there's this image of the beast that comes alive, and the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed.
Right.
So this is all happening. And so there's a killing of those who will not worship the image of the beast. And the beast already has been wounded, has had this beast, this what the Bible calls this son of perdition, this Antichrist.
Kind of like a false resurrection.
Yeah.
Where he's wounded in some way. It could be metaphoric to his empire, or it could be literal to his person. But some sort of a mockery, demonic mockery of the resurrection of Christ is happening.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a really big theme in the book of Revelation that we always need to grab, is that it seems that there is a parallel
Right.
to the life of Christ and the workings of Christ with the workings of Satan and his Antichrist.
Right.
And so, but then it says, he causes both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead hands. And that word mark means like to brand.
Right.
You know, it's something that's very noticeable on their right hand and on their forehead, so that no one may buy or sell except he have the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here's wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of man. His number is 666. Now, I always hear Iron Maiden playing from then on, but that's me growing up.
Yeah.
For all those heavy metal fans out there that used to listen to that kind of music, that's where a lot of us first heard the Bible. Actually, was through these records, and it certainly sparked my attention when I heard it as a kid. I was like, "What? The number of the beast? Oh my gosh, man!" But anyway, that's the context of that passage. So there's a lot of worship there. There's a lot of killing going on, who don't worship the beast, they're killed.
Right.
So it seems like a real volitional thing happening.
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, the two main reasons why you would discount the coronavirus vaccine mandates as being the mark of the beast is because there's a historical context to the mark of the beast that we're not in. Right. There is no Antichrist that we can see. We know the actions and the activities of the Antichrist in the first 3.5 years. There is no political figure who's mirroring that, as well as it seems like taking the mark of beast is an action of worship, and resistance is met with execution, not just, you can't go to the gym.
Yeah, I think it's in the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
Maybe it's Revelation chapter 20 that talks about the beheading of those that did not
resisting. Yeah,
that are resisting. I mean, literally their heads are being taken off.
Right.
So it seems really serious, obviously, and it's not that what's going on is not serious, because it is,
right.
and there's a lot to be concerned about.
Absolutely. Me and Bo were talking about this a little before, where we don't believe it's the mark of the beast, but it is still unsettling. And it definitely seems to be setting a precedent from which a one world governing dictator would be able to basically do this kind of a thing and have it accepted. Meaning that if you are seeing leaders saying to you, you have to do this thing, you have to get this vaccine, otherwise you cannot participate in our society, that's an unprecedented amount of power being exercised in the United States. Other countries have already done this, by the way. Italy and France have already done this as a whole nation, right? So this is the first time in the United States, but to see how other nations have been utilizing the coronavirus pandemic as a means of gaining power has been unsettling for Christians for sure. So that kind of leads me into the second point. The second way we could tackle this is, as a pastor, as someone who is an associate pastor of this church, how do you view this, and what would you do if this kind of thing happened in Tucson? If they said you cannot go to church?
Man, that's a heavy question. I don't know. In all honesty, that is something that I would go to the board on. That's why a church has a board of elders.
Right.
And I know that's kind of passing the buck a little bit, but really that's not a decision for me to make.
Right.
And
I think it's cool that you say that, because in this highly politicized culture that we live in,
mm-hmm.
it's seeped into the church, where it's like we are willing to fight with one another and lambaste one another and attack one another and accuse one another of being demonic just for taking a different stance. So there are things that we can't compromise on as a church. We can't say the government tells us that we can't preach the gospel anymore, so I guess we're supposed to submit to the government, right? There are things that we draw a line on as a church and we say we cannot cross it. But there's a lot of different ways that we approach things like governmental crackdowns and even oppression that you see throughout the history of the church. So, for instance, there are some Christians who during the Roman oppression of the church went underground. They weren't out preaching their faith in a public display. They were trying to keep it hidden so that they can do the work of the gospel from a more hidden vantage point. And some Christians looked at that and they're like, that's evil. That's wicked. You need to be out there. You need to be preaching your faith. And if you die, you die. And they're like, hey, we're willing to die. If someone like came into our house and said, deny Christ or we'll kill you, we'll die. But why would we go out and just lay down our lives right now when we could continue to live our lives in a quiet, peaceful way? 1 Timothy chapter 2. And be able to share our faith. What's wrong with that? So it's okay for Christians to have debate. And I think what you're saying, which is really wise, is different churches are going to address this in different ways. And I don't think that there is necessarily a sincere right or wrong, but that is something that would weigh heavy on anyone who's running a church right now and any board.
Yeah, and seeking wisdom from the multitude of leaders within a body of Christ is, what the Bible would tell us to do anyway. It's good to seek counsel, right. And so that's what I would do. Even though, thanks for putting me on the spot, man. That was problem, awesome. Dude. I appreciate that.
You're my mentor, man.
That's right. Hey,
I ask you these tough questions.
Well, listen to what I said. Yeah. Okay, S.A. Eagleton is in the house with us. I'm so stoked. And he says, hello, how come Matthew 2, it says that an angel told Joseph to take his family to Israel, but just a few sentences later he is told to leave the area because he's scared in a dream? Why didn't God just tell him to go to Nazareth in the first place?
All right, so let's go to the passage and we'll read it and we'll try to figure out what exactly this question's about. Thank you so much, S.A., for the question. So this is Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel, and by the way, the they that's being referenced there would be the wise men who came to Jesus. We're not really sure how old Jesus is at this time, but to give the very famous gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So now when they had departed, they being the wise men, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord out of the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, interestingly, the background here is when the wise men first arrived in Israel, they didn't really know where Jesus was. So they went and they talked to Herod, and when Herod heard that there might be someone in his kingdom being called the King of the Jews, he freaked out a little bit and came up with a plan that he would execute this child if he could find him. Now, when the wise men don't give up the location of Jesus, he makes a different plan to execute all children under the age of 2. So in order to escape this persecution and this death, Jesus' parents are told by an angel to leave Israel to go to Egypt. Now, that being said, I'm not fully sure, to be honest with you, S.A., what your question is. Because in your question it says, how come in Matthew 2 that an angel told Joseph to take his family to Israel, but just a few sentences later he is told to leave the area because he's scared in a dream? Why didn't God just tell him to go to Nazareth in the first place? So Nazareth is in Israel. Maybe your question is, why didn't Joseph stay in Israel but go to an area where Herod wasn't going to execute Jesus? I have a couple of ideas on that. You wanna
sure.
Add some stuff?
Yeah, you can go for. You can go for it. I want to hear your breakdown.
Okay. Now, why going to Egypt is actually prophetically important. Actually happens in verse chapter 15. So in verse 15, Matthew, the entire point of Matthew's gospel, by the way, is to demonstrate to the Jewish people that Jesus is their Messiah. So he's taking the Old Testament messianic prophecies about Messiah, and he's showing that Jesus fulfilled them and how he fulfilled them. So in verse 15, he quotes an Old Testament prophecy. And it says, and he was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. And that is from Hosea, the prophet Hosea. Now, interestingly, this is not a direct messianic prophecy, meaning it's not something that is directly saying this has to be the Messiah. But what Matthew is seeing by reading Hosea and by reading these other Old Testament prophecies about God delivering his people from Egypt and calling them out of Egypt, is he's saying Jesus symbolically fulfills the fleeing of Israel into Egypt, right? If you remember in the book of Genesis, Israel went into Egypt to escape a famine, a worldwide famine that was going to destroy everyone in the land of Canaan. And they huddled in there, but then eventually were called out of Egypt to go back into Israel in order to fulfill their promise to God in the land that he had given to them. So here Matthew is drawing a parallel, and he's saying in the same way God treated Israel in the Old Testament, God is now utilizing the Messiah, who's the ultimate Israelite, to demonstrate this same, or to mirror this same journey, but in a perfect way as opposed to a fallen way. Because as you see, if you read in the book of Genesis and Exodus, Israel made the journey, but they didn't make it as succinctly as Jesus did, and there was a little bit of failure along the way. Jesus does the same journey, but he does it perfectly to demonstrate God's perfect plan for the Israeli people. Any other thoughts that you have on that?
I mean, I think what I'm hearing from you is that the reason, to answer the question, S.A. Ingleton's question, is the reason God didn't tell him just to go to Nazareth in the first place is because there was in a sense, a prophetic fulfillment that needed to take place.
Right.
And because of that, that's why there was, in a sense, this delay.
Right.
And I think that's what you're getting at.
Right. And from a political standpoint, by the way, going to Nazareth would not have been a safe place. We know historically the reason why Nazareth was such a backwater was because it was actually a place for politically endangered people to go. So people who had genealogical connections to King David were kind of hiding out there because the Romans were basically hunting down everyone that would have a tie to the kingly line of David in order to exact their rule over Israel. So there's a good reason why Joseph and Mary would be called out of Israel as a whole, just from a political standpoint, but more importantly, there's a prophetic standpoint.
Yeah, because I think the question he's thinking, or the person's thinking, why didn't God just call them to Nazareth and get out of this area of Bethlehem?
Right. Because Bethlehem and Nazareth are two different cities.
Right.
And they're very far apart, landmass wise, yeah. Right. And I think, again, that would be the main reason, would be the prophetic reason.
Okay. Got it.
Hope that helps, S.A. Let us know.
Yeah, and so Matthew is a book that does emphasize the prophetic fulfillments of Christ. But I can't think of anything maybe off the top of my head would be another reason why God didn't just say, hey, just go to Nazareth and everything will be fine.
Right.
Maybe because Nazareth is north.
Right.
And maybe God had a plan to, get them to Egypt,
right,
which is south. And maybe that's a part of it. I don't know.
Right.
Exactly.
And again, do we know that Jesus would have been safe in Nazareth? Would he have actually been safe in that area, or would he have not? Would someone in Nazareth maybe called out and been like, hey, Herod's looking for a guy who's called King of the Jews. Mary's claiming that she has this divine conception, and it could have been dangerous for them to go to Nazareth. So we're not really explicitly told that in the text. That's speculation. But the thing that we are explicitly told is that there's a prophetic reason.
Okay, so you guys can get a hold of us at questionsforhope@gmail.com. That's questionsforhope@gmail.com. Or you can definitely just give us a Bible question that you've been thinking of. It can be about anything in the Bible, on the Facebook page or the YouTube channel as well. So I'm going to pull from the old trusty questions here.
You didn't want to go into the question that we had?
Oh, yeah, the good question that we had.
Yeah.
Man, that's right. We had a great question, and that was, is the Bible sexist?
Yeah. No, it's a great question, one that is definitely alive and well in our culture today. Both, I would say, from people who are opponents of the Bible, but also a good deal of a Christian movement, the progressive Christian movement especially, has been utilizing the idea of sexism in the Bible as a reason or a cause to get away from strict literalism when it comes to interpreting and following the dictates of the Bible. So by the way, those of you guys who don't know what progressive Christianity is, there's many different flavors of it. There's many different perspectives on it. But at core, the idea is, and you guys, even in political terms, you may even hear it in the name. We have liberals and conservatives. Conservatives are trying to conserve. Right? What are they trying to conserve? They're trying to conserve the original intent of the founding documents. That's what it means to be a conservative. A liberal or progressive is someone who's saying, hey, that was good for the time, but we're not living in that time anymore, so therefore the documents can be moved, they can be reinterpreted, and they need to be updated for modern times. So progressive Christians kind of fall into that same category, where they're like, hey, the Bible was written at a very specific historical time, and for that historical time it was good, but we don't live in the time that the Bible was being written, and therefore we shouldn't have to follow the dictates of the Bible to the letter, but we should update them. So it's not a complete departure. It's not like the Bible is all garbage, but it's that we can look at it and we can see that, hey, these things are historically not relevant for us, or culturally they're not relevant for us. So let's update, let's move beyond the original interpretation of the Bible, and let's move into something that's more culturally relevant for us today. And one of the big lightning rods for the progressive Christian movement, as well as a lot of people who are opponents of the Bible today, would be the sexism mentioned in the Bible. So I'm going to give a couple of the reasons why these people would believe that the Bible is sexist, and me and Bo are going to try to tackle them as best we can. Whoa. So the first reason that they would give would be the laws within Deuteronomy and Leviticus that clearly give rights to men that women do not have. And I'll give you a couple examples. The first one would be if a woman becomes a widow, she is given to the brother of the person that she was initially married to. That's not something that happens to men, meaning that if the woman dies, the man doesn't go to the sister of that person, but he's free to remarry whoever he wants. He has a little bit of a liberty there. The marriage rituals that are described for us in the book of Leviticus, especially ones for captive women, allowing in Deuteronomy, I think it's 28, for men to select women amongst the captives to shave their head, put them through a different ritual, and then marry them without seemingly considering their consent at any point. Also, women were considered ritualistically unclean for a lot of the times that they would need to go to the temple because of menstrual cycles. When a woman was going through a menstrual cycle, she was not ritualistically clean, and she was also unclean after she had kids, and the timing for her uncleanness was longer for having a female than a male. So they would look at things like that, and they would say, okay, sexism is clearly rooted in law.
A lot of those reasons why a lot of people, when you talk to them about the Bible, they go, man, I don't like that Old Testament.
Right.
They go, man, that stuff's, and it's so funny. I was doing a quinceañera the other day, or a few months ago. And I remember the person who I was talking to, just a guest, was saying, I just don't like the Old Testament for all these reasons. And it was kind of neat because I had the privilege of doing the blessing at the quinceañera, and when I did it, I did all passages from the Old Testament. And this lady came up to me and she was like, wow, that was so beautiful and so pretty, and the scriptures were amazing. And my wife says, yeah, that's in the Old Testament. And it was kind of funny. Yeah. Anyway, little story.
Yeah, that's right. And so the Old Testament becomes a huge lightning rod. So now here's the main contention. This is where it comes from. Mm-hmm. The law that governed Israel was written by God. So therefore, if God writes a law that is sexist, therefore God and the Bible are sexist. So how would we respond to that?
Well, I think one of the things I would first respond to is that it's not really what I think. That and I think, and my thoughts go that direction right off the bat. That a lot of times we want to exercise our own opinions, and it's funny. Like most people that are giving opinions on this really don't believe in objective truth.
Right.
And so it's kind of all subjective preference anyway. So, which I find really interesting, right? It's like, you're going to talk about maybe the Bible is the Bible sexist? Mm-hmm. But yet my question sometimes would be, well, is there objective truth? Do you believe in even objective truth? Because if it's subjective, then it's just your subjective. Why are you criticizing that subjectivity? I mean...
So an even more like concrete way to put it would be like, is there an objective standard of sexism? Mm-hmm. So what if I don't consider these things sexist, right? Does that make it true? Or is there some sort of a standard out there that would tell us that there is a way that men and women ought to treat one another, and the Bible's not upkeeping it?
Yeah, so they obviously are kind of showing that they do, in a sense, believe in objective truth.
Right.
Even though I'm not sure they would say that.
Right. And the question is what is your objective standard?
Yeah.
So
what
if you're going to accuse the Bible, you have to have some sort of an objective standard that you're accusing the Bible by.
Yeah. And so that's one thing that I would definitely have to bring up, is the idea of, do you believe in an objective truth? Where does that come from? Where is the standard for objective truth that you're obviously conveying? Mm-hmm. Or is it subjective preference? Because if it's subjective preference, then it's just
what you think.
It's just what you think.
Yeah. And again, like, if you're going to say, well, our culture dictates it, well, our culture's been a little off, right? So even the progressive would have to say, like, well, yeah, America's been a little off. Well, what makes you think it's right now?
Yeah, right? And growing up a secular progressive, with a socialist dad, we back 30 years ago, 40 years ago, felt like the system was fully wrong.
Right.
And to believe in, like, say, big government or big corporations, big pharma, that was all considered like, you don't do that.
Right.
That it's all propaganda driven.
Yeah. And even to give just like a really quick example, you grew up when first wave feminists were still alive and kicking.
Yeah. Andrea Dworkin.
Right.
Catherine McKinnon.
Right. And they are now at odds with second and third wave feminists. So even the feminists would disagree with what sexism really constitutes. There are some, to just give one clear example, there are some feminists who believe that women acting in pornography and stripping and doing things like that is incredibly empowering for women. And then there are some women who don't think that way, right? Who are like, no, that's degrading, and it's allowing us to be objectified by males. So that there's no way that's empowering, and there's a debate. So even within the feministic movement, there's a debate about what constitutes sexism.
Yeah. So, pulling it into a biblical framework to get to this idea of sexism, and it's a big question, because first of all, what is sexism?
Right.
Sexism, like, I forget the Webster's dictionary term, but it basically has to do with taking one sex and presuming that sex is superior over the other.
Right.
Now, this is something that we don't have a scripture that says men are better than women.
Right.
And, and this is why. Right. Like, they're more superior in God's eye. We have these social laws within the Torah,
right,
that are quite, I don't know what the word is, but they're not really, I wish there was more.
Yeah.
There's like a few verses here and there, and you kind of go, okay, that, like, when you go to war and,
right,
you there's this woman and you take her, and if, that kind of thing. But there's not a whole lot there.
Right. And just real quick, there's some more conservative Christians that I think fight this in a way that's very hurtful to the Christian cause. And the way they fight it is they try to justify all these passages and suggest that they're not sexist. That's not sexist. Like, that's totally cool. And we have to remember that the law was given to Israel, who had a host of issues and problems, and the legalistic code that God gave, not the moral, right? The morals in the law are perfect. They come from God's perfect character. But the legalistic and the judicial things that God is giving to Israel are imperfect, because they're given to govern an imperfect people. If God gave a perfect law to Israel, they would all be executed, because then God would have to say, don't sin ever, or else you're going to die, right? That would be God's perfect legal code. But he makes allowances, and Jesus himself says this in Matthew 19.
Right.
I'm not going to read the whole passage, but in Matthew 19, the Pharisees come to Jesus and they ask him about divorce. And Jesus says, you should never divorce, right? He quotes Genesis, and he says, divorce is always bad. And in verse 7, they respond and say, well, why then did Moses give a command to give a certificate of divorce and put her away? So in other words, what they're saying is, okay, well, if divorce is always bad, then why does the law give an allowance for it? Now listen to Jesus' response. It's very telling. He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So Jesus is clearly saying divorce is bad. It's always bad. Well, then why is it in the law? Jesus says because there's something wrong with the people being governed. And if God were to take away an allowance for divorce because of the corruption of the hearts of men, it would actually set women up, and men too, for more abuse and more difficulties than to allow this thing for the corruption of their hearts and their culture. The same thing would be true for these allowances for women. We shouldn't look at these and be like, that is so good that a guy, after taking over a woman's hometown, can select her, cut her hair off, and then force her into a marriage. We wouldn't look at that as a good, but given the circumstances, it's a good. Meaning, given the circumstances that the alternative would be that she would be sold into slavery or executed, that's better than allowing this guy to marry her. There's no allowance for him to rape her.
And it's interesting because Jesus says, because of the hardness of your hearts, that law was given.
Right.
So we know that there was laws within the Torah that were given to the people of Israel to restrain.
Right.
So we can't just look at these passages and go, hey, this is given to actually, instead of restraining, the opposite of to restrain is to indulge.
Right.
Like these passages aren't given to indulge. It seems like what Jesus is getting at is that the Torah, there's parts of the Torah that are given because the people's hearts are hard.
Right.
Human beings' hearts are naturally bent towards evil, and there's a restraining work that the law is providing on the human soul, on the human heart, not to rape, pillage, and do these kind of things that seem so natural.
Right.
Now, Jesus also says, do not think I have come to destroy the law and the prophets, and I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And so we see that there's a fulfillment of the law.
Right.
There's the law wasn't in a sense it's the perfect.
Right.
It's not that the commands were holy and righteous and just, meaning thou shalt not commit adultery and thou shalt not murder.
So the morality,
Yeah. But the social laws, they all are there for a particular purpose. But there's a fulfillment of that Christ came to bring.
That's right. So in other words, Jesus would look at this and say, it's not like I've come to abolish the law. Instead, and you actually see him doing it right here with the Pharisees, he's like, I'm getting back to what the law is really supposed to be about. So in other words, these allowances that were in the law, in a way, Christ is coming and taking those allowances away and saying, we're going back to original intent. And that's why he goes back to Genesis, as opposed to quoting through, because he could have gone other places. He could have gone to Genesis and talked about the screwed up and dysfunctional marriages of the patriarchs and stuff. He doesn't go any of those places. He's like, let's go back to where God originally created. Its original intent. It's man and woman. There is no sin. What did that look like, right? What did that look like? And let's get back to there.
Yeah, and there's another perspective that I want to give with this question about, is the Bible sexist? Now, when I first started reading the Bible, I came from a very secular background. And so when I read the Bible, I had a lot of presuppositions that I had in my mind on what the Bible had in it, Yeah. And when I read the raw parts of the Bible, it made me think, wow, the Bible really is telling it like it is. Yeah. It's telling about human nature really as human nature is. So if I read a history book or I studied a particular history of any ethnic group of the world, I would come across war and famine.
Some ugly stuff.
And rape.
Yeah.
And abortion.
Right.
And killing. Just all kinds of evil, awful things. What most people would say is wrong.
Right.
And I can't imagine people saying that that's right.
Right. We would agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And but when I read the Bible, I didn't look at those passages and go like, man, God is for rape.
Yeah, I want to emulate that.
Like, yeah, I didn't think God was for it when I read the Bible and I read these Old Testament passages. It made me think that that people have been the same, everywhere. And there's a twilight zone from back in Rod Serling days where people are alike. Everywhere, I think it's called, and it really, resonated with me with the Bible is that really people haven't changed much,
right.
If at all, over the years. But I never associated it with, God is vindictive per se.
Right.
That God's character is one of just being vindictive.
Right.
So when Joshua goes in to take the land and there's this killing of the Canaanites, I never looked at it as like, God's main character is one of, taking over places and militarily, driving out everybody. It seemed like it was for a particular place, for a particular time,
right.
with a whole backstory to it.
Right.
And obviously there was other characteristics of God that were being expressed: his care for the people of Israel, his love for them, his desire for them. These kind of things were always expressed in the scripture. But the point being is that from not reading the Bible at all to reading the Bible, I didn't necessarily just go, oh man, look at the Bible, it's filled with all a bunch of stuff. That's and you say this is of God, that's coming from a presupposition.
Right.
Right? You're presupposing that when you read the Bible, you're going to read about, angels on clouds,
right.
and saints,
yeah.
and all this, like, Jesus walking in the field,
right.
like in the cool of the day with
right.
the roses and stuff like that. And so you come in with that presupposition.
Right.
And then you're bummed that it actually is talking about the real life. It's still carrying this real life picture mm-hmm. of what humans are capable of.
And that's it's a misinterpretation of what category of literature the Old Testament is. The Old Testament is written in narrative format, and those of you guys who have just watched movies or read books, you're reading and interpreting things from a narrative perspective. And when you watch a movie, the director might show some stuff that's really wicked, but that doesn't mean he's for it. It just means that he's showing it. And actually, narrative can be a very effective way to show morality, because you don't just say, hey, adultery's bad. You can show a movie where a guy commits adultery and you see the fallout. You see all the negative consequences of that action and behavior. In the same way, God can say, hey, you shouldn't multiply wives as the pagans do, Deuteronomy 17, verse 17, but it's more effective to read the life of these guys who had multiple wives and see what a wreck their marriages were, and to be like, that's why God said it. So that's why you have that narrative format. But another thing that's really interesting, and it goes to the heart of this objection and the heart of this issue, is, and I'm going to use a political phrase to help people understand this.
What?
Is the difference between a systemic problem versus an external problem. So a political conservative, believes that systemically, or at core, the founding documents of this country are good and therefore should be preserved. A progressive believes that fundamentally the founding documents are flawed and therefore need to be changed. That's the idea. Now, that's a systemic problem. If the founding documents are flawed, then we do have to change them in order to progress, in order to get better. But if bad things happen in a country, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a systemic problem. So, for instance, the issue of slavery. Some people could say, well, slavery happened in America, so therefore America was built on a system of slavery and is systemically flawed, so we should change that. Others would say, well, no, it was the founding documents and their philosophical contention that all men are created equal that caused Americans to fight a bloody civil war in order to preserve those founding documents. So it's not that the system was flawed, it was that there was external people who weren't living up to the system. And the same thing is true with progressives versus the Bible. If they believe the Bible is systemically flawed, that it has systemic racism, sexism, and issues and flaws like that in it, then we do need to progress beyond it in order to succeed. But if you believe, no, systemically the Bible is good because the system, the root, the core of the Bible is God's character and nature, which is perfect, as well as the laws of God, which are built upon his character. And therefore, that's what we understand. But in the Bible, you're right, there are issues in the Bible because the Bible records flawed, sinful human beings. So I'll give you an example of this. This passage is an important one because when Paul's making his argument here for equality, so if you were to ask, like, does the Bible ever say that men and women are equal? Well, it does, actually. And there's a really interesting passage that we can go to.
Prove it, bro.
Yeah. There's actually a couple passages I could go to, but this one's an overlooked one, which I think is unfortunate, because Paul's argument here is a systemic one, meaning he is going back to the character and nature of God's being to make his argument. And if God's being is immutable, which the biblical authors argue, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, then this foundation, this system...
Immutable means not changing.
Not mutating, right?
Yeah,
not changing. It is fundamental. Now listen to this. This is 1 Corinthians 11, verse 2. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. That last section is the most important one. So Paul's drawing a direct correlation between men and women and Jesus and the Father. Now, the question becomes, if man and woman are supposed to reflect Jesus and the Father, are Jesus and the Father equal in the Bible? Is the nature of God equal? And the obvious answer is, well, yeah. But you also have to say, does that mean that they therefore have the same roles and responsibilities and privileges? And the answer is no. There's a hierarchy within the Godhead that is honored by the Son as well as the Father. The Father did not take on flesh. The Father did not die for our sins. The Father was not sent by the Son. The Son was sent by the Father. So there are differences and distinctions between men and women in the Bible because we're supposed to reflect God.
So sometimes when you hear the word sexism, you can kind of get a little confused because what you're talking about is that different sexes have different roles in the Bible. And that's not necessarily sexism.
Right.
Unless it could be if someone defines sexism
Right.
as equal roles.
Right. Equal in all aspects.
Equal in all ways, which is actually a contradiction because men and women are different.
Right.
Just biologically.
Right.
And so it's when we say like they're equal in all ways, we kind of go, well, all means all. And then we run into a problem.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a true statement. So I could see how people are defining sexism or sexist really is going to win the argument.
That's right. So if you define the terms, you define the argument, and you win the argument. So if I'm allowed to define every aspect and the fundamental premise of the argument, then by definition I always win. So if I say the Bible is evil, but I reserve the right to define evil, then I'm going to win. I'm going to win the debate. But if instead, and this is the key, we look at it from the objective standard, which the premise, as you already pointed out, the premise of the argument is the Bible sexist, alludes to the idea that there is some sort of an objective standard of sexism. But the question is who gets to define and look at what the objective standard of sexism is? So we as Christians would look at it and say, sexism for us would just reference the way that sexes ought to be treated, right? How should men treat women and women should treat men? How should that look? How should we see one another? How does our equality look? And we as Christians always argue backwards to systemic, that is the nature of God. We always argue back to the nature of God because we believe we're made in the image of God. That makes sense to us. But if you're going to say, well, the Bible is sexist, but I'm going to define what sexism is, then of course you're going to win the argument because you've defined the terms. So it's very important, if you're going to talk to someone about it, it's very important to say, well, define your terms. What do you think sexism means? And there's by the way...
Oh, I was going to say, share that other passage too you wanted to share about being the idea of equality of men and women.
Oh, okay. So this is a very famous one. It's in Galatians. And I'm just going to quote it from memory because I don't want to flip there right now.
I'll flip there.
But in Galatians, I believe it's chapter 3,
yep.
Paul says, "For there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. We are all one in Christ." So the idea there is Paul is taking all the ways that people might distinguish themselves from each other and suggest an inequality. So he takes race, he takes culture, he takes barbarian, Scythian, by the way, that's race. Then he takes culture, Jew and Gentile. Then he takes sex, male and female. Then he takes class, slave or free. And he says all are one in Christ. There's this idea that we all have an equality before God because we were made in his image and because we were bought with the same price. So that's a very direct passage.
Very cool. Very awesome.
There's a funny comment here by Rich.
Yes. Funny comments. We like funny comments.
So he says, so the Pharisees were ancient Republicans. What do you think about that one?
I want him to go. I want him to. Rich, what do you mean by that? Like, so they were ancient Republicans. What do you think he means by that?
So I think so. They're maybe, and I get what you're saying, Rich. There's a conflation of terms that conservative necessarily means Republican.
Oh, okay.
We have to understand conservatism is an ideology, and there's actually multiple political groups that consider themselves conservative, whereas Republican refers to a very particular political party.
Yeah, so, I was raised very progressive, conservative.
Right. Which are contradictions. But what he might be saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rich, and I know it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but what you could be saying is the Pharisees were ancient conservatives because they were trying to conserve the Torah. They were trying to conserve and preserve the ancient teachings of the Bible, even to the extent that when Jesus came and said, hey, you can't put new wine in an old wineskin. In other words, Jesus was a little bit progressive, but in a different way.
Yeah.
So he's not looking at the nature of God and saying that's systemically flawed. He's looking at the law and saying there's issues with the law. Why? The hardness of hearts of man and the failure of man to actually upkeep the law.
Yeah, thanks so much for tuning in today. I know we might not have done just what Pastor Scott, would have loved, but we're hoping we did.
It's his birthday. He's happy.
That's right. That's right. No, we were blessed. We're just joking, and we had a blast with you guys. You guys have a great day. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona. Welcome to A Reason for Hope, your question connection with the entire Word of God. We'd love for you to join the conversation. Simply follow us on our Facebook page at Calvary Christian Fellowship. If you have a question, please text or email us at questionsforhope@gmail.com. And on today's episode, we have a special guest. Let's tune in